Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you for another Film Fanatic show. So today's show is on a movie that, well, I would say it was probably my most, for me personally, my most anticipated movie to see this year, and that is Fede Alvarez's Alien Romulus. I got to see it last night with a good buddy. We went to go see it. We drove all the way to Saco, Maine. Got back pretty late. Got back about 2:30, quarter to 3 in the morning. But we drove all the way to Saco and saw it in IMAX. So I felt like that was a movie to, really experience in IMAX. So today's show, I'm going to be talking about the whole movie and my feelings about it. And usually I like to, you know, when I go to the movies, I will talk about that movie or that experience, either whether it was a good experience or a bad experience. I love I love the I love the whole world or environment of the movie theater. I love that experience. So I talk about it for good or bad. And generally, when I'm not talking about movies that I've seen in a theater, I pretty much focus on movies that I really love. And most of, well, 98% of the movies that I talk about on this channel are all movies that I own in my collection. So Alien Romulus was a movie that I was, hugely anticipating. I feel like there's been so much talk of this movie. There's been, you know, the trailers came. Once the trailers came out, I feel like the world has been in this frenzy for anticipating this movie. I really love Fede Alvarez as a director. I think his his work on the Evil Dead remake and also Don't Breathe are just they're just incredible movies. The thing that I really love about Fede Alvarez as a director is I really love his like gritty kind of aesthetic. His movies are kind of low down and nasty. They have this rawness to them, and I feel like he'll take movies and take storylines into some pretty disturbing areas, and I feel like he is a risk. He'll take some risks. And he'll work so well in the confines with working with a big studio, and he'll push the envelope. And so initially when I heard that there was going to be this new Alien movie, again, I'm not. A lot of people are always talking about how much they love the franchise, the franchise of Alien, and again, it's all. These are all my opinions, and that's kind of where it all stops, and I love that people have differing, very different opinions about things, and I also love when people can give a good, I don't know, argument for what they can articulate, their opinions really in an intelligent way and or a relatively intelligent way, and yet be respectful. But for me, it's like the Alien franchise. I'm a huge Alien fan, but when I say I can't really say that I'm a fan of the franchise because I feel like, realistically at the end of the day, out of all of the movies that have come out, it always goes back for me. It always goes back to the first two films. Ridley Scott's film Alien and James Cameron's Aliens. Those two movies have been talked to death, and but I think rightfully so because those movies are amazing classics. I think they changed the world of horror. They changed the world of science fiction as we know it. And I think as far as sequels go, Aliens is one of the greatest sequels ever, and kind of it's kind of an unprecedented feat because it's incredibly hard to follow such an iconic movie. I think other examples of that. One other movie or franchise that comes to mind is The Godfather. The Godfather being my first movie, and Godfather Part Two just being equally masterful, and you know probably the greatest sequel in history. But so it's, and I feel like Aliens is at that level. But Alien 3, afterwards you had Alien 3 that came out, and then you had Alien Resurrection, and then you had Ridley Scott trying to take the franchise into a much different direction with Prometheus and Covenant. And then there's like two or three crossover films, Alien vs Predator. There's like two of those, I believe. So it's a huge franchise. And the only other movie, and it comes up a lot, the only other movie in the franchise that I sometimes recommend to people is to, if they haven't seen Alien 3, to check that out, because I really love David Fincher. He's one of my favorite directors. Of course, directed Seven and, Fight Club, Gone Girl. And I always recommend to people, if you're a David Fincher fan, definitely check out Alien 3, because it was his first movie. Even though, that being said, I always tell people, definitely check it out, because visually it's stunning. You can really see Fincher's style kind of coming into it. You could see elements of his, genius as a filmmaker. But the film itself is not very good. And, he has always talked about the horrible situation he was put in because of the executives and all of the pressure to kind of make the movie this and then change the movie into that. He didn't have any control over the movie, and there was all kinds of studio interference. So the movie itself is not very good, but it does have elements that are very, very cool and very dark. And I think the soundtrack, the score by Elliot Goldenthal, is probably one of the greatest horror film scores ever made, if not the greatest. So it has a watchable quality, but it's, as a whole, I don't think it's a good movie at all. It does have some really terrible things about it, but there are some things about it that are, likable or worth checking out. The rest of the movies in the franchise, I just think are, as far as I'm concerned, just they're garbage, and should have probably never been made, and or they could have been they should be set on fire and flushed down the toilet, as far as I'm concerned. And I know that's a strong opinion, but hey, that's just how I feel it at face value. And I feel like what happens with franchises, they try to milk an idea and it becomes a cash cow, because it is a cash cow. The franchise is a huge name. So, and the studio just scrambles and scrambles and scrambles to try to like capitalize on something that they've established that's iconic, and they just can't figure it out again, because they get lost in their own narrative. And so I've always felt that way. So when I say when I hear people talk about that they love the franchise, it's like, I love the two movies in the series that I think are amazing. But as a franchise, I feel like, realistically, I think the franchise itself is kind of a disaster, you know. But I was really intrigued when I heard that there was going to be this new Alien movie, and then I was really excited when I saw that Fede Alvarez was going to be, a part of this movie, because, again, what he's done with, the Evil Dead remake and then Don't Breathe, those are incredible films, really great, and really, just low down and dirty horror films, and really suspenseful. They're real gritty. They have this rawness to them. So I'm a huge fan, and I like that he takes the story and storylines and his characters into some, like, pretty uncharted territory, and he's not afraid to get a little batshit crazy at times, and that's why I love his work. So when I saw that he was going to be doing this new Alien movie, automatically I was like really intrigued, and then I became really interested. And as the trailer, I think there's 2 to 3 trailers that came out. I was super excited, and Alien Romulus became my favorite, my most anticipated movie of 2024 by far. So I went last night and saw it. And I will say that, like, and I might, I don't know, include some spoilers in this discussion. So be forewarned. There's a little bit of that. I'm just going to try to talk about the movie and the experience for what it is. And, I've had about 24 hours to digest the experience and the movie. So, and I will say that, like, the timeline of this film is, and it was, I had heard about it early on, but the timeline of Alien Romulus is it basically takes place between Alien and Aliens. It basically follows soon after Alien. And the thing that was cool, I mean, there's a lot of great things. There's a lot of things I honestly was turned off by. But I think visually, um, aesthetically, the this film really has a grittiness to it. The way the film is shot, like the tech in the film is so in line with the first two films. It has a grittiness to it. It's kind of dirty. The the cinematography for this film is just incredible. The setup, the opening sequence for this movie is really engaging and really cool. And again, I did say at the top of the show, we saw it. Me and my friend Mike saw it last night in IMAX. So seeing it in IMAX, IMAX is just mind blowing, and it's just incredible. I wish we saw it at the theater, the IMAX theater in Saco. I wish it was a little bit closer because it's about 2 hours. It's a 2 hour drive, just about. But it was worth it. It was totally worth it to see it in IMAX. So when you see something in IMAX, it's kind of the most, I don't know, heightened way, most intense way you can see a film. I mean, it's complete and utter immersion in the art of film. So visually, the sound, everything was just incredible. But the film itself, I thought, it had a really great opening, has a really great opening, and it had this feeling that you were, being brought to that world. Well, especially with the kind of the whole truckers in space, the first film, as Ridley Scott's always described it. And the movie that was the biggest kind of influence on Ridley Scott for Alien was Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original. So it has this grittiness, it has a really small cast, and it has this, I don't know, like the introduction to the characters, the small crew of people that is in this film is very good. And it has this real cohesive thing to the timeline of Alien and Aliens, which I thought was really great. Visually, it's absolutely stunning. And there is this, and I like that. I love the pacing of the film. It has a little bit of a slow start, and I think that was definitely. I feel like it was definitely intentional. It does harken back to the storytelling of what Ridley Scott laid before as far as the foundation for this world. So it has that slow burn. I think there is a really incredible attention to detail around the world building. And again, it's astounding. It's beautiful. The music is really pretty fantastic. And so as things progress, it's very good. It's very suspenseful. There are, I do wish, in hindsight, I do wish that I didn't see any of the trailers. I think the trailers kind of did a disservice to this movie because there are sequences in the movie that are totally revealed that I didn't. I wish I didn't see. That was one thing I didn't like. So it wasn't when those scenes came on or came up. I knew what was going to happen, unfortunately. But getting there was unique and little and different. So there again, this film really captures that world, and really sticks with that timeline of Alien going into Aliens. It definitely has that aesthetic, that vibe, that essence, and it has that kind of old school, kind of haunted house. This movie is definitely more of a horror film. It's got again amazing science fiction elements and world building, but it's very much more of a thriller horror film. But the interesting thing was like about 30 minutes, 35 minutes into it, I started to feel like that essentially the build up and the setup, the storyline of this film, like the core of this film is basically it's the same exact thing as Don't Breathe, which was the last Fede Alvarez movie that came out a few years back, which is an awesome movie. But I felt like this was essentially Don't Breathe, the same exact setup, the same characterization about these young kind of kids that are struggling and have more or less this terrible existence, and they have this scheme to rob and to break into this facility. And to me, it was like at that point in the movie, I felt like, wow, this is exactly note for note, Don't Breathe, but in space. So which that movie is really, really great. I really love that movie. But I kind of felt like, okay, it's working. It's working. I'm down with this. I'm into it. But then I thought, well, maybe it's a little bit. I don't know. I started to feel maybe the story is lacking a little bit of originality because it felt like it was so by the numbers, and it was totally in step with that film, Don't Breathe, as far as the arc of the characters, the little backstory that you get on this young group of people, these kids essentially that are trying to survive on this in this kind of horrible situation that they're in. That's kind of hopeless. They're really desperate, and so it was. I felt by the numbers, it was exactly the same storyline, and I thought it was working. But I also was like, oh, I kind of felt honestly, I was hoping it was going to um, be different, something unique. Because I felt like when I first saw Don't Breathe, it was really unique, and it had a real high level of suspense, and it wasn't really predictable because I felt new and fresh. But I felt this was like essentially the setup was exactly the same as that movie. But I was along for the ride, and once you're getting into the film, and it evolves to where it's becoming, more obviously of a horror movie and a slasher movie, if you want to call it that. And they do come in contact with the the face huggers, the alien creatures, and all the monsters. It definitely, the intensity is turned up, and it gets going, and it's kind of full throttle from that point on. And so, I thought some those sequences were pretty thrilling and incredible, and I was along for the ride. I was digging it, and then Fede Alvarez started introducing elements in the film that were you know, pretty unique, and there are sequences in the film where I kind of got this feeling of, wow, I've never seen an alien or a xenomorph do that. I have never seen this in a alien film before. This is new and interesting. So it got me going. It got me into the film. Um, and then so as the film is progressing, there is this, and the other thing that's really cool about this movie. Not only, I mean, it's incredibly beautifully shot. The music is really great. You know, I was still a little bit on the fence with the actual plot of the movie. It felt like, okay, it's literally the same setup. It's the same, it's the same premise as Don't Breathe. After I saw this movie, I looked up a couple of reviews, and I watched a review by Chris Stuckman, who's a huge, probably the biggest movie reviewer on YouTube. And that was the first thing he said. He really was really critical of the movie. And that was the first thing that he said. And I was like, you know what? After I watched his review, I was like, you know what? He's kind of spot on about this movie. It is the first half, the first act of the movie is literally that movie. And but again, there were enough newer aspects that were introduced to the movie that I was like, okay, no, I'm into it. But I was still thinking of those the Don't Breathe comparison where I was a little bit turned off by it, and it was a little bit predictable because of that. So anyway, the film is progressing. There is some really great action scenes. There's some really great kills. It has really great atmosphere, very suspenseful. It has that very claustrophobic feel, which is really wonderful. Seeing it in IMAX was incredibly. It's just so intense. And that along the way, without trying to get too much into the spoiler thing, overall, I would say for people to check this movie out. But there is midway through the film or so, there's a character brought back, basically, who is a main character from the first Alien movie, and they bring this character back, and I felt like, and this character that they bring back in the film is completely CGI, and up until that point, everything you're seeing in this film, like the other, which I think is one of the strengths about why I love Fede Alvarez, is that he's all about like the old school kind of practical effects. So all before this sequence, it's all like the majority, 95% of this film is all practical effects. But then they reintroduce this character from the first one, and it's pure CGI, and for all intents and purposes, it looks like fucking shit. It looks so bad. And this character that they reintroduce into this film, becomes almost like a central character, and he is in the movie almost throughout the rest of the film. And the CGI, I was astounded by and I have to say, my first impression when I saw this character being brought back, and then the way that they show him, it took me out of the movie. It totally took me out of the fucking movie. Because I was like, why did they decide? Because to me, it's so obviously bad. Like, the CGI representation of this character is just so terrible. And it just stands out where it's just kind of hangs over everything and casts a shadow in a bad way. And I thought it was cool and kind of interesting that they brought this character back, but I was like, why did they do it this way? And that was, again, I try to, obviously a lot of films can be, I watched a lot of the same movies, an endless amount of times, and a lot of movies mean things differently to you as you see them, or they age really well, or maybe they don't, and you realize you don't like that movie, or maybe your initial watch of a film, you don't really like it because maybe you have too much, too much of a preconceived idea or notion of what you're expecting, but then it grows on you. So you have that experience, and so I thought, okay, maybe that's what is happening. But I felt like it was. But I also try to base my opinions on movies on my kind of my gut reaction, and what ends up happening, I feel like most of the time is when I have that. My first reaction, for the most part, is usually how I end up kind of feeling about a movie, And again, these are just personal opinions. But when I saw that, when they reintroduced this character who was a one of the main characters in the first Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien, I thought, okay, that's an interesting idea, but the way they present him in this really terrible, using this horrendously bad CGI, it immediately took me out of the movie, and I was just like, what? But I was in in the movie. I was into the movie at that point, and I was along for the ride. And after that point, I started seeing that they were, and again, in my opinion, the only really two movies in the franchise that are just masterpieces, it is are the first two. Again, I've said the third one is good to see if you're a David Fincher fan, but as a film, it's really not very good. David Fincher even says that. But it's worth seeing just to maybe get a glimpse of his kind of genius, of him, of what he would eventually become. But as a movie, it's not very good. And I've said repeatedly that rest of the films in the franchise, I just feel like probably should have never been made. And so what ends up happening is after this goes on with this reintroduction of this character, there is a massive dose of fan service that ends up happening, and to where there's all of these like so incredibly or just blaringly obvious references to all of the other films in the franchise, including the movies that I feel were the least popular, the most hated movies, and the most terrible movies in the franchise. And there's all these references to all of those movies, and it's like this totally strange, kind of weird fan service to the movie, to the franchise. And suddenly, it was, it felt really predictable and disorienting. And I was like, once that started happening, in all honesty, I was like, why are they doing this? Why do they, like, for instance, why are they acknowledging, why are they trying, one of the things that they do, this is a little bit of a spoiler, is they really try to reintroduce the whole Prometheus concept into this movie. And it kind of becomes a big part of the movie, especially the ending. And I'm just like, what the fuck? Like, that movie is such a big fucking misfire. Yeah, Ridley Scott was going for something a little bit more abstract, but it was ultimately an epic fail of a movie. And I'm like, why the fuck are they like, they have this thing that's established that is cool and unique. Why are they like insisting that they got to pay tribute to a movie like that, which is not very good? But then they do the same thing for movies that are even worse to a degree with Alien Resurrection and then Alien 3 and also Covenant. They have these glaring reference points to these movies throughout the rest of the film, and then the ending, the last 15 minutes of this film, I felt was her, and I almost hate saying it, but I felt like the last 15 minutes of this movie was so disappointing because it really dives into this whole like fusion of where they're trying to tie in the whole concept of what Ridley Scott was trying to do with Prometheus. And I was just like, what the fuck is going on? And it totally took me out of the movie. And I'm like, they had me all the way. Fede Alvarez had me all the way. And then I'm like, why are they doing this like really just gross use of fan service? And of all movies, they're going to pay tribute and focus on these movies in the franchise that were just fucking terrible. and ruin. I feel have ruined the franchise. So why are they doing that? Like they could have, you know. I saw an interesting review, and I totally agree with it. And they made some great points. It's like Alien was its own unique thing when it came out and was established as this iconic monster movie. But then when James Cameron directed it, the sequel, there's no references at all to the first movie, barely. It's its own thing, and it's like, why did they insist that it has to be this thing of where they gotta appease all of the fans? It's like exactly what they did with the newer Star Wars movies, with the Force Awakens and uh, the Last Skywalker. All where they have to pay homage. They can't. They have to like. They wanna appease and they wanna like make everyone happy as opposed to just telling a good story and doing something that is in its literal sense its own movie, and that you can watch the movie without necessarily having to have seen all of the other movies. Which this movie, I feel, if you hadn't seen any of the other Alien movies, you would be lost. And I think a classic example of fan service to a degree, that's done very very well, and it all has meaning and it makes sense. The last Deadpool movie, Deadpool and Wolverine, which I thought was an awesome movie, a great experience. There's tons of that. They really, Ryan Reynolds really listened to what people wanted, but I felt like they took a risk. They did use that into account into the story, but the way they use that kind of idea, it all makes sense. Like it does something new with it, but it makes sense. It's not out of context. It doesn't throw you off. But I feel like what they did with this film, what Fede Alvarez did with this film, it doesn't. It took me out of the movie, in all honesty, and it was the whole kind of thing that I felt really hindered the same exact thing that really got in the way of the last few Star Wars films, where it was like, oh, okay, we gotta appease fans of the animated series, and then we gotta appease fans of A New Hope. We gotta like throw all these elements in to just make everybody happy, and but there's nothing, when you first see Empire or you first see A New Hope, like you're seeing something new and different, and it's original, and you're not concerned with like paying tribute or making people happy. You're just concerned with making a good movie and a new and interesting story. And I think James Cameron did that. There's not barely any references to that. It's just about telling a good story. But because this whole thing has become this massive franchise, and I feel there's all of these varying opinions, I think the studio sets out to do this thing of where we gotta make everybody happy to make money, and I feel like that's what happened with this movie, and I realize like most people, from what I've heard, really love this movie, and I think it's worth seeing. I think with along with these negative things I'm saying about the movie, I feel it's definitely the best movie in the franchise since Alien and Aliens. I think it's definitely the best movie. I think it's better than most of the films. It's up there with Alien 3. I think this movie is a better film. It's definitely a more cohesive movie. It's more of a thrilling movie, and it makes more sense. But I don't feel it's anywhere as near as good or as those first two movies are such trailblazing movies and original. And I don't feel like it's really on par with that at all. And the bar, again, in comparison to the rest of the films, the bar in the Alien franchise as a whole is really fucking low, so it's not saying much. I do recommend this movie, but ultimately, those things that I've talked about kind of ruined my experience. So, yeah. Thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.